The story of Salem in 1692 begins not with fire and smoke, but with the quiet weight of a winter pressing heavily on a small community. Salem Village, which today is part of Danvers, Massachusetts, was not a place of bustling streets or grand buildings. It was a farming settlement made up of scattered homesteads, rough dirt paths, and families who lived close to the land. The population was only a few hundred people, but within those few hundred lives lay enough tension, fear, and mistrust to ignite one of the most famous panics in American history. To fall asleep while imagining Salem is to picture a frozen landscape, snow blanketing the fields, smoke curling up from chimney tops, and families huddled close to hearth fires. Candles burned low, tallow sputtered in small dishes, and the sound of the wind against wooden shutters was constant. This was not a prosperous or easy village. Winters in New England were unforgiving, and the daily work of survival, hauling water, cutting firewood, mending fences, tending animals, was hard, endless, and often carried out in bitter cold. Life was also colored by religion. Salem was a Puritan settlement, founded on strict religious beliefs that emphasized discipline, humility, and the constant battle between God's chosen people and the forces of Satan. From the moment children could understand words, they were taught that the devil was real, that he prowled the world seeking souls, and that sin opened doors for him to enter. Church was not simply a Sunday obligation. It was the very framework of existence. Laws, morality, even personal disputes all carried religious weight. Salem Village, though, was divided. The settlement was technically part of Salem Town, a wealthier port community a few miles away, but its farmers resented the merchants and traders, who seemed to grow rich while they struggled. Some families supported closer ties to the town. Others insisted the village should stand on its own, with its own minister and church. These disputes simmered year after year, sometimes quiet, sometimes breaking into open quarrels. At the center of the conflict in 1692 stood Reverend Samuel Parris, the minister of Salem Village. Parris was not a beloved leader. He had come to Salem in 1689, bringing with him his wife, children, and a Caribbean slave named Tituba. Parris demanded obedience, insisted on strict discipline, and often preached about enemies of the church and the dangers of spiritual corruption. His salary was a constant source of dispute, and many villagers distrusted his leadership. Yet others saw him as a necessary authority, someone who would defend them against both worldly troubles and the snares of the devil. In this atmosphere of suspicion, division, and religious intensity, small sparks of unease could quickly grow into fire. Outside threats weighed heavily on Salem as well. The 1690s were a time of war on the frontier. Colonists in Massachusetts lived under the shadow of violent conflict with French forces and their Native American allies. Refugees from these wars poured into towns like Salem, bringing stories of devastation and loss. Families displaced by raids carried with them trauma, fear, and resentment. The sense of being under siege, spiritually from the devil, physically from enemies beyond the frontier, made Salem's people more watchful, more suspicious, and more willing to believe that unseen forces might be working against them. Day-to-day life reflected these fears. Villagers knew their neighbors' business closely. A broken fence, a sick cow, or a failed crop could all be seen not as mere misfortune, but as signs of spiritual trouble, perhaps even evidence of witchcraft. The Puritan worldview did not allow for chance. Every event had meaning, whether as a blessing from God or as an attack from Satan. If a child fell ill without explanation, or if butter refused to churn, people looked not to medicine or science, but to the invisible realm for answers. Against this backdrop, Even small oddities took on great significance. Strange behavior in a child, an argument between neighbors, or whispered gossip could spiral into something much larger. And in the long, dark nights of winter, when work slowed and minds turned inward, imaginations often drifted toward fears of witches, spirits, and the devil himself. Salem in 1692 was, in many ways, an ordinary farming village. But it was also a place primed for panic. Religious strictness, political divisions, economic struggles, and frontier wars created a powder keg of unease. All that was needed was a spark, and that spark would arrive quietly, in the home of Reverend Paris, where young girls began to exhibit strange fits that no doctor could explain. Before those dramatic events unfold, it is worth pausing to take in the stillness of Salem at the start of the year. Imagine walking the village paths at twilight. The snow crunches underfoot, smoke drifts lazily from chimneys, the air heavy with the smell of wood and cooking broth. From a distance, the meeting house stands dark and austere, where the center of community life, where sermons of fire and brimstone echo each week. Homes are dim, lit only by hearth and candle. Inside, families gather, women spin wool, children recite prayers, and men sharpen tools for the work ahead. Everything feels ordinary. But under that ordinary rhythm, suspicion lurks. The Salem Witch Trials did not begin suddenly with accusations and arrests. They grew from soil long prepared by years of hardship, fear, and conflict. To drift into sleep with this image is to sense the quiet before a storm, the uneasy calm of a village on edge. Soon, whispers would spread, accusations would be made, and the lives of many would change forever. The story of Salem's witch panic begins in the home of Reverend Samuel Paris. His parsonage stood at the edge of Salem village, a modest house of timber and smoke, where the family lived according to strict Puritan rules. Reverend Paris, stern and often anxious, carried the heavy burden of guiding a divided congregation. His sermons thundered of sin, obedience, and the dangers of Satan's influence. But it was not his words in the pulpit that would ignite the trials. It was what happened quietly, within the walls of his own home, that set Salem aflame. In the winter of 1692, Paris's household was tense. The minister's finances were strained. His authority was questioned, and quarrels in the village spilled constantly into his ears. Yet inside the parsonage, the children were restless. The cold months limited their freedom to play outdoors, and they sought diversion in ways that would later be seen as dangerous curiosities. At the center of the storm was 9-year-old Betty Paris, the minister's daughter, and her cousin, 11-year-old Abigail Williams, who lived with the family. Like many children, they were lively and curious. But that winter, their behavior changed in ways that startled the household. The girls began to suffer from fits that defied explanation. They shrieked, contorted their bodies, and fell to the floor as if seized by invisible hands. At times, they barked like dogs or crawled under furniture. Their cries echoed through the house, and their strange gestures unsettled all who witnessed them. At first, these fits might have seemed like childish mischief or illness. Yet they continued, growing more dramatic and difficult to ignore. Other girls in the village soon displayed similar behavior. Ann Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, and Mary Walcott, all between the ages of 11 and 19, were drawn into the strange contagion of fits and visions. Their actions became the subject of whispers in the village, whispers that grew louder with each passing day. The Paris household sought help. A local doctor, William Griggs, examined the girls, but could find no natural cause for their suffering. In a time when medicine was limited and poorly understood, unexplained illness was often seen as the work of supernatural forces. Dr. Griggs's diagnosis, whether spoken plainly or implied, was alarming. The girls might be under the influence of witchcraft. This suggestion struck a nerve in a community already steeped in fear of the devil. For Puritans, witches were not figures of folklore or fairy tales. They were real, living agents of Satan, capable of bringing harm through invisible means. The belief that the devil could afflict children, using human instruments as his tools, was not only plausible, but terrifyingly persuasive. And if witches were at work in Salem, the minister's own household seemed to be their first target. Within the parsonage, the atmosphere grew heavier. Betty and Abigail's fits became daily occurrences. They claimed to see visions of spectral creatures and spoke of being pricked or pinched by unseen hands. At night, their cries could be heard beyond the walls, unsettling the neighbors. Servants and family members grew anxious, and even Reverend Parris himself seemed unsure how to respond. Was this the devil's assault on his ministry? Or something worse, that his enemies within the village would use the girls' suffering to further discredit him? In their desperation, the girls and their caretakers turned to forbidden practices for answers. They pressed Tituba, the enslaved woman from the Caribbean, to use folk knowledge in hopes of identifying the cause of their torment. Tituba's position in the household was precarious. She was both caregiver and outsider, respected for her knowledge, yet distrusted for her difference. It is said that she told stories from her homeland, tales of spirits and magic that fascinated the children during long winter evenings. Whether these stories were innocent diversions or misunderstood by the fearful Puritans, they later became part of the accusations against her. The curiosity of the girls also led them toward a common pastime among the young, fortune-telling games. One such game, known as the Venus glass, involved cracking an egg into a glass of water to see what shapes might form, supposedly revealing the future. Though it might seem harmless, such practices were considered sinful dabblings in the occult by the Puritan faith. When Betty, Abigail, and their companions tried these games, they may have seen frightening shapes or imagined ominous signs. In the tense atmosphere of Salem, such experiments only deepened their fears. As the fits worsened, the village could not ignore what was happening in the minister's home. Visitors came to witness the strange afflictions. Ministers from neighboring towns observed the girls and confirmed the suspicion that this was no ordinary illness. Their judgments lent weight to the idea that Salem village was under a spiritual assault. If the devil had invaded the parsonage itself, what safety could anyone else claim? The whispers spread beyond the parsonage walls. Neighbors exchanged stories. Some shook their heads in pity, others in alarm. Was God punishing the village for its quarrels and divisions? Or had the devil truly found allies among them? Each explanation was frightening, and each carried consequences. It is easy, as we drift into sleep, to imagine the dim rooms of the Parris house during those nights. The fire crackling low, shadows flickering against rough wooden walls. A child crying out suddenly, her small body writhing in an unseen grip. The minister pacing, his brow furrowed, torn between fatherly fear and spiritual dread, and outside, the snow-covered village, unaware that these strange fits would soon draw everyone into a storm that no one could control. The girls' afflictions were the spark. By themselves, they might have faded, explained away as illness or youthful invention. But in Salem, where fear was already thick in the air, the fits became proof of something darker. The village was about to turn its eyes upon itself, searching for witches in its midst. The parsonage whispers would soon become public accusations, and those accusations would spread like fire in dry grass. By February of 1692, the strange fits in the parsonage could no longer be dismissed as a passing oddity. Betty Paris, Abigail Williams, and the other afflicted girls had become the center of attention in Salem Village. Their cries, their contortions, and their fearful visions drew onlookers who whispered of witchcraft. The tension that had long simmered beneath the surface of the community was now given shape. If witches were tormenting the minister's household, then someone in Salem was in league with the devil. The pressure to identify a culprit grew strong. Reverend Paris, unsettled and defensive, faced the possibility that his household's troubles would weaken his position further in the village. For a man already surrounded by quarrels and opponents, the thought was unbearable. The afflicted girls, whether consciously or not, sensed this expectation. Their cries began to take on clearer direction. They did not merely scream of unseen torment. They began to name names. The first to be accused was Tituba, the enslaved woman who lived in the Paris household. She had long been viewed with suspicion by some villagers. Her foreign origins, her storytelling, and her use of folk knowledge set her apart from the Puritan world. In the eyes of the fearful, difference itself was dangerous. When the girls pointed to Tituba as one of their tormentors, the accusation found ready listeners. Alongside her, two other women were named, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne. These first three accused would come to symbolize the vulnerability of the outcast, the poor, and the unconventional in Salem. Sarah Good was a destitute woman, often seen wandering from house to house, begging for food or shelter. Her sharp tongue and disheveled appearance made her unpopular. When neighbors refused her requests and later suffered misfortunes, some whispered that her muttered curses had brought them ill luck. In a village where charity was prized, but suspicion was stronger, Sarah Good's poverty marked her as an easy target. Sarah Osborne was different. Once a landowner of some standing, she had scandalized the community years earlier by marrying her indentured servant and becoming embroiled in land disputes. She had not attended church regularly, and her name carried a shadow of disapproval. In the eyes of her neighbors, she was a woman who defied expectations, and in Puritan Salem, such defiance was rarely forgotten. The choice of these three women, an enslaved outsider, a poor beggar, and a woman who challenged social norms, reveals much about the fears of Salem. Accusations of witchcraft did not fall randomly. They struck those already standing on the margins, those who carried little protection from wealth, reputation, or strong allies. When the girls accused them, the village stirred with unease. To accuse a neighbor of witchcraft was not a small matter. It meant declaring that person an enemy of God, an ally of Satan, and a danger to the community. Yet in the charged atmosphere of Salem, such accusations were both shocking and strangely believable. In early March, magistrates John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin traveled to Salem to conduct examinations of the accused. These were not trials as we might imagine them today. Instead, they were public interrogations, held in the meeting house before gathered crowds. The afflicted girls were present, their fits and cries serving as dramatic evidence of the invisible torment. When Sarah Good was brought before the magistrates, she denied the charge of witchcraft. Yet the girls shrieked and writhed as she spoke, claiming her spirit was attacking them even in that moment. The sight of children seemingly afflicted at her presence weighed heavily on the minds of observers. To many, it looked like proof. Sarah Osborne, sick and frail, also denied the accusations, but her poor health, her irregular church attendance, and her tarnished reputation worked against her. Few were willing to speak in her defense. Tituba's case, however, unfolded differently. At first, she denied the charges, but under questioning, whether through fear, pressure, or a calculation of survival, she confessed. Her testimony was startling. She admitted to signing the devil's book, to seeing strange creatures, and to working alongside other witches in Salem. She even described encounters with black dogs, red cats, and spectral figures. This confession electrified the village. By confirming that witches were indeed at work, Tituba gave voice to the fears already thick in the air. She did not merely accept guilt, she expanded the story, suggesting a conspiracy of witches spreading through Salem. For the magistrates and the villagers, her words were both terrifying and strangely reassuring. If witches were real, then their troubles had a cause. And if confessions could be drawn out, then perhaps the devil's servants could be rooted out and destroyed. The first accusations thus became a turning point. What began as strange fits in the parsonage had now become public charges of witchcraft. Confirmed by the dramatic testimony of a confessed witch, the boundaries of suspicion had widened, and the search for hidden enemies had begun. As we drift into sleep, we can imagine the scene in the meeting house on those March days. The dim interior crowded with neighbors, the magistrates seated sternly at the front, the afflicted girls gasping and crying out, and the accused women standing in fear. Outside, the wind rattled against the shutters, carrying with it the weight of a winter still lingering. Within, however, a different kind of storm was building, one of fear, accusation, and belief. The first accusations were not the last. They were the opening notes of a grim chorus that would soon grow louder. Tituba's confession had thrown open the door, and behind it lay a path leading to more arrests, more trials, and more deaths. Salem village had crossed a threshold, and there was no turning back. When Tituba confessed, the mood in Salem shifted. What had been whispers, doubts, and fearful speculation suddenly solidified into certainty. The devil was here. He was not a distant threat or a vague theological concept. He was walking in their village, working through neighbors, perhaps even family. The admission gave flesh to fear, and once it had flesh, it spread quickly. Tituba's words were vivid. She spoke of signing the devil's book, of seeing animals that spoke in strange voices, and of witches flying through the night. Her descriptions carried the weight of imagination, folklore, and terror all at once. Some wondered whether she spoke from true experience. Others suspected she told the magistrates what they wanted to hear to avoid harsher punishment. Yet in a society primed to see Satan's hand behind every misfortune, her confession was not taken as fabrication. It was accepted as truth. The devil, to the Puritans, was no metaphor. He was a real and active presence, plotting tirelessly against God's people. Every crop that failed, every child who sickened, every quarrel between neighbors could be traced back to his schemes. The world was seen as a battlefield between divine order and demonic rebellion. In such a worldview, a confession like Tituba's was not shocking exaggeration. It was proof of the ongoing war. The belief in Satan's presence was reinforced by the afflicted girls. Their fits grew more dramatic. They claimed to see spectral shapes, ghostly forms of the accused tormenting them. They screamed of claws, of burning sensations, of invisible blows. Their testimonies meshed perfectly with Tituba's imagery. The story of Salem was becoming consistent, detailed, and terrifyingly real. Spectral evidence became central. When the girls declared they saw a person's spirit afflicting them, the community gave weight to their words. If a girl cried out that Sarah Good's spectre pinched her, many believed Sarah Good guilty, even if she stood calmly in the same room, denying it. In this way, Unseen forces became visible through testimony, and courtroom drama became theater, with the afflicted as unwilling actresses. The devil in Salem was not only feared in whispers, it was performed before all eyes. Each fit, each vision, became public proof. The devil's presence seemed undeniable. It is important to understand why these tales carried such power. In Puritan thought, the devil worked through deception. He could take familiar shapes, disguise himself as neighbors, and whisper lies that tore communities apart. He did not appear with horns and flames, but in subtle forms: a neighbor's glance, a quarrelsome word, a strange illness. Tituba's confession fed directly into this expectation. The devil's book, the spectral animals, the coven of witches. It all fit the framework that people had carried in their minds long before 1692. The magistrates, John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin, seized upon this. Their questioning pressed the accused to admit guilt, to name others, to describe meetings with the devil. The more details they drew out, the more convincing the picture became. Each confession or accusation seemed to confirm the last, weaving a net of fear that grew tighter around Salem. But behind the drama was also human calculation. Tituba, by confessing, may have saved her life. Those who denied guilt often met harsher fates. Those who admitted it and accused others were, at least temporarily, spared. In this way, confession became both survival and a weapon. To point to another was to deflect blame. To add names to the devil's book was to shift suspicion elsewhere. Thus, the devil's presence expanded with each attempt at self-preservation. The atmosphere of Salem in early spring 1692 was one of mounting dread. Neighbors eyed each other with suspicion. Old feuds resurfaced, now cloaked in spiritual urgency. A quarrel over land could be recast as evidence of witchcraft. A disliked neighbor might suddenly be remembered as having once given a strange look, after which a cow sickened. Everyday grievances became holy war. For the afflicted girls, their role deepened. Whether seized by genuine psychological distress, swept up in the expectations of adults, or knowingly playing into the drama, their influence was enormous. Their cries directed suspicion. Their fits provided evidence. Their visions painted vivid images of the devil's work. In many ways, they became the living proof that the devil was loose in Salem. We can imagine the mood in the meeting house after Tituba's confession. The firelight flickering on anxious faces, the murmurs of neighbors wondering who might be next, the heavy silence when a new name was spoken. Every sound outside, the creak of trees, the cry of a night bird, might feel ominous, as if the forest itself hid Satan's agents. The devil was no longer distant. He was inside the village, inside their homes, and inside the very air they breathed. For people already burdened by harsh winters, fragile crops, disease, and political uncertainty, this was almost unbearable. The devil's presence explained their hardships, but it also magnified them. To live in Salem now was to live under siege, not from armies, but from invisible powers, believed to be embodied by those who had once been ordinary neighbors. As night falls in our story, we can feel the oppressive weight of that fear. The villagers lie in their homes, shutters drawn, listening to the wind. Some pray desperately for God's protection. Others rehearse in their minds the strange looks or quarrels of past years, wondering if they had brushed too close to the devil's servants. And the afflicted girls, sleeping or awake, carry within them the power to accuse, to condemn, and to reshape the fate of their entire village. The devil had come to Salem, not in smoke and fire, but in the whispers of children, the suspicions of neighbors, and the confessions drawn in dimly lit meeting houses. What had once been rumor was now reality. The devil lived among them, or so they believed. and that belief would shape the grim months that followed, leading Salem further into its dark spiral. With Tuba's confession echoing in the minds of Salem's people, the machinery of accusation began to move more swiftly. At the heart of this machinery stood a strange and troubling form of proof spectral evidence. To us, centuries later, it may sound like little more than imagination, but in 1692, it became one of the most powerful weapons of the court. Spectral evidence was testimony that someone's spirit, or spectre, had appeared to a victim and caused harm. The afflicted girls claimed that, even when the accused were miles away, or standing peacefully in the courtroom, their spirits could still torment others. These invisible assaults, pinching, choking, scratching, were accepted as real, even though only the victims could perceive them. The belief behind this practice was deeply rooted in Puritan theology. People in Salem understood the devil as a trickster who could work through human agents. If a girl fell into a fit and cried that she saw Sarah Good's spectre standing at her bedside, the community did not dismiss it as a dream. They believed it as proof that Sarah Good had allied with Satan, who lent her spirit power to harm others. The afflicted children became the key witnesses in this strange court of invisible crimes. When one of them cried out during an interrogation, claiming to see the accused's spirit attacking them, the room often erupted in chaos. The girls would shriek, twist, and collapse, their bodies acting out the supposed violence of an unseen hand. For the magistrates and many onlookers, this was difficult to ignore. The suffering was real, even if the cause was unseen. Yet, not everyone accepted spectral evidence without doubt. Some ministers, including Increase Mather, father of Cotton Mather, warned that the devil could take the form of innocent people to deceive. If Satan could mimic anyone's shape, then visions of specters might not prove guilt at all. But in the heat of the trials, such cautions were often drowned out. Fear overpowered reason, and the urgency to root out witches seemed greater than the risk of error. The way spectral evidence worked in practice was striking. During examinations, if a girl suddenly screamed that the accused's spirit stood before her, the magistrates would press the accused for a response. Denials often made things worse. If the accused claimed innocence, the afflicted might rather harder, as though the denial itself was an attack. The more the accused protested, the more convincing the girl's reactions appeared. It was a trap from which few could escape. The reliance on this kind of proof reveals much about the mindset of Salem. The Puritans saw the spiritual world as inseparable from the physical. Dreams, visions, and invisible forces were not dismissed as fantasy. They were woven into daily life. If someone dreamt of a neighbor's spirit pressing on their chest, it could be taken as a genuine encounter with witchcraft. What seems to us like imagination was to them another dimension of reality. This blending of worlds meant that the boundaries between suspicion and evidence blurred. Gossip about a quarrel, a strange dream, or a sudden illness could quickly transform into legal testimony. The devil was believed to operate through shadows, illusions, and deceit. And so, even illusions became part of the record. For the accused, spectral evidence was devastating. How could one disprove what another claimed to see? How could Sarah Osborne argue against a vision of her spectre choking a child in the night? No witness could step forward to contradict it, for the crime existed only in the invisible realm. The accused were left defenseless, caught in a net of accusations they could not untangle. Imagine the atmosphere in those examinations. The meeting house crowded with anxious villagers, the accused standing alone, trembling, their eyes darting toward the girls who writhed and pointed at them. the magistrates leaning forward, asking sharp questions. And in the corner, a murmur spreading through the crowd as neighbors whispered that they too had once seen something odd, a shadow moving strangely, a cow dying without cause, a dream that seemed too vivid to ignore. In such a setting, spectral evidence became more than testimony. It became theater, convincing in its drama and terrifying in its implications. The use of spectral evidence also served another purpose. It gave power to the powerless. The afflicted girls, many of them young, gained extraordinary influence over their community. Their cries shaped reputations. Their visions filled the jails. In a society where children and young women rarely had authority, their words now carried more weight than those of respected men and women. Some may have believed sincerely in their visions. Others may have recognized, even subconsciously, the sway they held. Whatever the case, their testimony became the foundation upon which dozens of lives were judged. Not everyone was comfortable with this. There were whispers of doubt, quiet conversations where neighbors admitted their unease. Could the devil really grant such power? Could innocent people be falsely accused? These doubts flickered like candles in the wind, fragile and easily extinguished by the roar of fear. For now, the court pressed forward, convinced that spectral evidence revealed the truth. As we drift into the quiet of night, we can reflect on the strange weight of invisible things. In Salem, unseen visions could condemn. Ghostly accusations could chain a neighbor and send them to the gallows. Reality itself seemed to bend beneath the pressure of belief. The devil's presence was felt in every fit, every vision, every trembling testimony. Spectral evidence was more than a legal tool. It was a mirror of the fear that gripped Salem. And as long as that fear endured, the invisible would carry the weight of the real, and the accused would have little hope of escape. By the spring of 1692, the examinations of the accused witches had become more than private interrogations. They unfolded in public, before crowds of villagers, in meeting houses filled with tension and curiosity. These sessions, led by the local magistrates, took on the air of theater. Salem had no playhouses or stages, but in these hearings, the magistrates presided as actors, the afflicted girls performed as witnesses, and the accused stood as unwilling participants in a grim drama. At the center of this stage were magistrates John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin, men of local standing tasked with investigating the growing number of accusations. Hathorne, in particular, gained a reputation for his sharp questioning and stern manner. Unlike judges in a formal court, the magistrates did not wait for juries or complex trials. Their examinations were immediate, pressing, and often theatrical in tone. The process was simple in outline, yet terrifying in practice. The accused would be brought before the magistrates, often in chains, and confronted with the charges. Witnesses, usually the afflicted girls, would stand nearby, ready to give their testimony. As soon as the accused entered, the atmosphere shifted. If the girls began to shriek, claiming the specter of the accused tormented them, the entire room grew restless. Every gasp, every fit, added weight to the proceedings. Hathorne's method of questioning made the stage even more dramatic. He often began by assuming guilt rather than innocence. "Why do you hurt these children?" he might ask, rather than, "Do you harm them?" Such questions trapped the accused, forcing them to defend against charges that already seemed established in the magistrates' minds. If they denied, the girls' convulsions seemed to refute them. If they hesitated, the silence was taken as proof of guilt. The villagers who crowded into these examinations were both audience and participants. They murmured among themselves, sometimes gasping at the girls, displays or nodding grimly when the magistrates pressed the accused. Neighbors occasionally stepped forward with their own stories. Tales of butter that would not churn, animals that sickened, or dreams of spectral visitors. In this way, the hearings became collective performances, where fear and belief reinforced one another. For the accused, the stage was merciless. Standing before the magistrates, they faced a wall of suspicion and noise. Chains clinked on their wrists and ankles, reminding all present of their supposed guilt. They spoke against a backdrop of cries and spasms, every word questioned, every gesture examined. If they looked too calm, it was said they lacked remorse. If they wept, it was taken as a ploy. Innocence had little room to breathe. The magistrates themselves seemed at times swept up in the drama. Though they held the authority, they were not immune to the power of the afflicted girl's performances. When a girl shrieked that the accused's spectre stood beside her, Hathorn often leaned forward, demanding the accused explain themselves. The magistrates treated the invisible as visible, the spiritual as real. In their eyes, they were guardians of the community, tasked with unmasking the devil's servants. These examinations could last hours. One by one, the accused were paraded before the crowd, each subjected to the same cycle of questioning, denial, and spectacle. The records show repeated exchanges where Hathorn pressed hard and the accused faltered under the weight of suspicion. In many cases, the accused were urged to confess, to name others, or to admit their pact with the devil. Those who resisted found themselves only deeper in the magistrates' gaze. The stage of the magistrates was not only a place of accusation, but also of spectacle for the community. In a town without theaters or formal entertainments, these examinations became grim gatherings, drawing neighbors from miles around. People packed into meeting houses to witness the unfolding drama. Some came from curiosity, others from fear, but all left with the memory of cries, denials, and the uneasy sense that evil might be closer than they imagined. This stage also served another function. It spread the hysteria outward. Each performance reinforced the idea that witchcraft was rampant. The more dramatic the fits, the more convinced the audience became. A neighbor who had doubted might return home troubled, reconsidering old quarrels or strange occurrences. The ripple of suspicion widened, feeding the next round of accusations. Yet, beneath the noise and drama, cracks of unease began to form. Some whispered that the girls exaggerated. Others wondered if Hathorn pressed too hard, or if innocent neighbors might be swept into the tide. But such doubts were rarely voiced openly. To question the magistrates or the afflicted was to risk suspicion oneself. And so, the play continued, each act darker than the last. As the examinations grew in number and intensity, Salem became a community on constant alert. To be called before Hathorn and Corwin was to stand not only before magistrates, but before the entire village. Every gesture, every word, became part of a performance that might decide one's fate. And once suspicion settled, escape was nearly impossible. In the quiet after such examinations, when the meeting house emptied and villagers trudged home by lantern light, the echoes lingered. The cries of the girls, the stern voice of Hathorn, the broken pleas of the accused, these sounds haunted the night air. Salem's people carried them home, replaying them in memory, letting fear seep deeper into their lives. The magistrate's stage was not built of wood and curtain, but of belief and fear. On this stage, invisible crimes became visible, and neighbors became enemies. Each performance convinced the community anew that the devil walked among them. And in this conviction, the path toward trials and executions was set. As the Salem Witch Trials unfolded, It was not only spirits and visions that drove the hysteria forward. Beneath the surface of spectral evidence and the magistrate's stage lay another force, quieter yet equally destructive: the tensions between neighbors. Salem Village in 1692 was a community already divided, and the trials gave old quarrels new fire. The village was small, but like many small places, it carried long memories. Families disputed over land boundaries, grazing rights, and inheritance. Fences sometimes shifted, livestock strayed, and tempers flared. In a world where survival depended on fields, barns, and family honor, even small quarrels could fester for years. By the time the witchcraft panic began, many villagers already viewed their neighbors with suspicion. The trials provided a channel for these suspicions to spill into the open. One example often noted is the dispute between the Putnam family and their rivals, the Porters. The Putnams, strong supporters of the trials, were deeply involved in accusations. Anne Putnam, Jr., one of the most prominent afflicted girls, belonged to this influential family. The Porters, by contrast, were more skeptical of the proceedings. Accusations often seemed to flow along the lines of these family alliances, as though the devil had taken sides in the disputes of Salem Village. Land was at the heart of many tensions. Boundaries were precious, and the shifting of a stone wall or the claiming of a meadow could spark years of bitterness. When accusations arose, these old grievances colored how neighbors interpreted them. If a cow sickened after grazing near a disputed field, suspicion naturally turned toward the rival. If a child fell ill, the family's enemies might be named as witches. Thus, the trials offered an outlet for grievances that might otherwise remain hidden in murmurs and grudges. It was not only land, but also reputation that fueled hostility. In a Puritan community, where piety and moral standing mattered greatly, a family's reputation could determine its influence and security. To be known as quarrelsome, lazy, or irreligious was dangerous. During the trials, such reputations became evidence. If someone had long been whispered about as troublesome, the leap to witchcraft required little effort. Accusation became a way to punish those who stood apart or caused offense. The sense of neighbor turning against neighbor deepened the tragedy of Salem. Testimonies often came from people who had lived side by side for years. A woman might accuse the midwife who had helped deliver her children. A farmer might testify against the neighbor who once lent him tools. These betrayals pierced the fragile fabric of trust in the village. Once spoken, suspicions were difficult to withdraw. To recant was to risk being accused in turn, so the accusations multiplied, one grievance feeding the next. The afflicted girls, too, were woven into these networks of rivalry. Their visions often aligned with the suspicions of their families. When Anne Putnam, Jr. cried out against a neighbor, it echoed the grievances her parents already carried. The girls may have believed in their visions, but those visions unfolded in a landscape shaped by adult disputes. Thus, private feuds and family alliances played out on the public stage of witchcraft accusations. The broader context of Salem also mattered. The colony had recently endured wars on its northern frontier, leaving scars of fear and loss. Refugees from Maine, driven south by conflict with native peoples, carried stories of violence and despair. Some of the afflicted girls had lived through these traumas, and the community at large felt the strain of insecurity. In such a climate, old grievances seemed sharper and the need for explanations greater. Witchcraft offered both a reason and a target. As accusations spread, the sense of betrayal deepened. Neighbors whispered against each other in taverns, fields, and kitchens. Families withdrew, uncertain who might speak against them. The trials encouraged secrecy, suspicion, and fear. Every misfortune became a potential weapon. A spoiled batch of butter, a sudden illness, a withered crop. In a village where almost everyone depended on everyone else, mistrust grew like a poison vine, curling into every household. The sorrow of this time lay in the way ordinary disputes became fatal. What might once have been a quarrel over land or gossip at a meeting house now carried the weight of life and death. A careless word could spark an accusation. A remembered slight could become proof of diabolical dealings. The web of suspicion tightened, and even the innocent found themselves trapped. When we think of Salem, we often imagine the afflicted girls, the stern magistrates, or the gallows at Gallows Hill. But behind these dramatic images lay a quieter, more human story, the story of neighbors who no longer trusted one another. The witch trials were not only about spirits and specters. They were also about envy, resentment, and the fractures of a small community. As the people of Salem gathered in their meeting houses, whispering names and trading stories, the boundaries between truth and grudge dissolved. Old quarrels found new voices, and neighbors became enemies. In this way, the witch trials were not only a battle against imagined witches, but also a reflection of the conflicts that had long simmered within the village. And so, Salem in 1692 became a place where invisible crimes merged with visible disputes, where spiritual fear combined with earthly envy. In the end, the devil the villagers sought to root out may not have been found in the shadows of specters, but in the bitterness of neighbor against neighbor. As spring turned to summer in 1692, the circle of accusations in Salem widened like ripples on a pond. What began with a handful of frightened girls soon spread into a wave that touched families across the village and beyond. Each new testimony pulled in another name, each arrest giving weight to the fears that had already taken root. The net of suspicion expanded steadily, and before long, few felt safe from its reach. At first, the accusations focused on those who already stood apart. Sarah Good was poor and sharp-tongued. Sarah Osborne had neglected church attendance, and Tituba was an enslaved woman from a distant land. Their marginal positions made them easy targets. But as the weeks passed, the pattern shifted. The afflicted girls began to cry out, not only against the fringes of society, but also against respected members of the community. This change marked a turning point. When Rebecca Nurse, a pious and elderly woman, was accused, many villagers felt unease. She was known for her devotion, her kindness, and her faith. Yet even she could not escape the widening circle. The afflicted claimed to see her spectre tormenting them, and though some spoke in her defense, the tide of fear proved stronger. If a woman like Rebecca Nurse could be accused, then truly anyone might be guilty. The same was true for others of good reputation. Martha Corey, known for her seriousness and regular attendance at church, was soon swept into the trials. At her examination, she insisted she was innocent, and she questioned the credibility of the afflicted girls. But this very doubt was used against her. To challenge the girls was to suggest they lied, and in Salem's fearful climate, to deny the truth of spectral evidence was almost as dangerous as being accused. Her refusal to accept the claims of witchcraft became further proof, in the eyes of many, that she herself was in league with dark forces. The expansion did not stop with individuals. Entire families felt its weight. Husbands and wives, sisters and brothers. Even children were caught up. The Putnam family, already heavily involved, pointed to neighbors one after another. The accusations spread like wildfire, jumping from house to house, until it seemed no household was beyond suspicion. The more names that were spoken, the more the trials gathered momentum. Geography, too, expanded the net. The early accusations centered in Salem Village, but soon neighboring towns felt the ripple. Andover, Topsfield, and Ipswich all became entangled as the afflicted girls traveled, or as villagers whispered beyond their borders. Fear was not confined to one parish, it spread across Essex County. Those who heard of the events in Salem carried the stories back to their own communities, and suspicion followed. This widening circle also revealed how fragile reputations were. In ordinary times, a sharp word or a strange habit might be overlooked. But in 1692, every eccentricity became potential evidence. A woman who mumbled after a quarrel, a man whose livestock thrived while others failed, a midwife present at too many difficult births. Each became vulnerable. The trials taught people to reinterpret ordinary misfortunes as signs of witchcraft. The net expanded not only outward to new places but inward, to capture behaviors once ignored. The afflicted girls themselves seemed tireless. In the meeting house, in the courtroom, and even on the village green, they fell into fits at the sight of those accused. Their cries and contortions drew crowds, and their words carried heavy weight. As their circle of accusation grew, they gained influence far beyond their years. What began as whispers from children became proclamations that could determine life or death. Some historians believe that the girls, whether knowingly or not, directed their accusations according to the disputes of their elders. Others suggest that once their cries were believed, they could no longer stop, lest their own credibility collapse. Whatever the cause, the effect was the same: more names, more arrests, and more fear. The courts faced a difficult task. Each new accusation demanded investigation. Each arrest added to the swelling prison cells. The jails of Salem, Ipswich, and Boston soon filled beyond capacity. Men and women, young and old, waited in cramped and unsanitary conditions, their fates uncertain. Families were left without providers, farms untended, and households broken. The cost of suspicion was not only spiritual but practical, and the whole community bore its burden. Yet even in the midst of this expanding net, some voices of doubt remained. A few ministers urged caution, warning against relying too heavily on spectral evidence. Some villagers hesitated when accusations touched those they respected. But fear has a way of drowning out doubt. To question too strongly was to risk accusation oneself. And so, though unease stirred beneath the surface, the trials pressed forward, gathering more lives into their grip. By midsummer, it was clear that Salem was no longer dealing with a handful of troubled children or a few suspicious figures. The entire community was entangled in a web of fear and accusation. No one could say who might be next. To live in Salem in 1692 was to wake each morning with the knowledge that a neighbor's word could place you in chains by nightfall. The expanding net was more than a pattern of arrests. It was the unraveling of trust, the collapse of ordinary bonds between friends, kin, and neighbors. Each new accusation was another thread pulled from the fabric of community, leaving it frayed and fragile. Salem was no longer simply a village in Massachusetts. It had become a stage where fear, rivalry, and belief intertwined in a drama that would claim dozens of lives before it ended. By the early summer of 1692, Salem had reached a point where suspicion alone was no longer enough. Accusations had multiplied, arrests had filled the jails, and the colony demanded something more formal than examinations and whispered testimony. To restore order, and perhaps to prove that justice still held sway, the colony's leaders created a special court, the Court of Oyer and Terminer. Its purpose was clear: to hear and determine the cases of witchcraft that now overwhelmed Essex County. The establishment of this court marked a shift. What had begun as murmurs in a meeting house now entered the solemn halls of official justice. Chief Justice William Stoughton, a stern and deeply religious man, was appointed to lead the proceedings. Alongside him sat other magistrates, each determined to preserve the safety of the colony and the purity of its faith. They believed themselves engaged in a battle against Satan's servants, and they carried the weight of that conviction into every session. The first major trial under this new court was that of Bridget Bishop, a woman already known for her unconventional ways. She owned a tavern where men played games and drank late into the night. Her manner was bold, her clothing sometimes bright in a community that valued modesty. Bridget had faced accusations of witchcraft before, years earlier, and though she had escaped conviction, her reputation was far from spotless. In the courtroom, the afflicted girls once again fell into dramatic fits, claiming that Bridget's spectre tormented them, even as she stood before the magistrates. Witnesses spoke of unexplained misfortunes, of cider turning sour, of animals dying after quarrels. Some said that small poppets, or dolls used for spells, had been found hidden in her home. Against such a tide of testimony, her words of denial carried little force. The court accepted spectral evidence, visions, dreams, and the invisible assaults described by the afflicted. This decision sealed the fate of many who stood accused. For if the mere sight of an apparition could condemn, what defense could possibly succeed? To deny the existence of the spectre was to question the afflicted girls, and to question them was to risk seeming complicit in their torment. Bridget Bishop was found guilty, and in June 1692, she became the first person executed in the Salem Witch Trials. She was hanged at Gallows Hill, watched by a crowd of neighbors whose emotions ranged from righteous satisfaction to silent dread. With her death, the trials had crossed an irreversible threshold. The colony had chosen a path where fear and justice intertwined, and where death became the ultimate proof of guilt. The execution of Bridget Bishop set a pattern. Each new trial brought the same blend of afflicted testimony, neighborly grudges, and spiritual conviction. The court, empowered by its authority, pressed forward, believing that each guilty verdict cleansed the community of hidden evil. But rather than calming fears, each hanging seemed only to heighten them. If witches truly walked among them, then surely there were more yet to be uncovered. The atmosphere in Salem during those first trials was heavy with tension. Families gathered outside the meeting house, waiting to hear the outcomes. Ministers prayed fervently, urging their congregations to trust in divine justice. Yet beneath the public displays of confidence lay a private unease. Some whispered doubts about the use of spectral evidence. Others wondered why so many respected neighbors had suddenly been named. But few dared to voice these doubts openly. To question the process was to risk accusation. Inside the courtroom, the mood was a strange mixture of formality and frenzy. The magistrates sat in judgment, the afflicted girls writhed and cried out, and the accused stood surrounded by both neighbors and strangers. The air was thick with fear, yet also with a sense of spectacle for the people of Salem. These trials were not only about justice, but also about witnessing a cosmic struggle made visible in their own village. The trials also revealed the deep divisions within the community. Some families aligned themselves firmly with the afflicted, supporting their testimonies and urging harsh punishment for the guilty. Others, often connected by kinship or friendship to the accused, struggled with quiet resistance, offering petitions of support or whispered prayers. In these divisions, the fractures of Salem widened further. The very act of bringing the accused into formal trial gave the accusations new weight. What might once have been dismissed as rumor now carried the force of law. The gallows loomed over the proceedings, a stark reminder that words spoken in the heat of fear could end a life. For the accused, hope dwindled with each passing day. Once named, few could escape the tightening grip of suspicion. Yet there remained a ritual calmness to the process. Witnesses were questioned, testimonies recorded, verdicts pronounced. It was justice as the Puritans understood it, stern, uncompromising, and bound to the belief that unseen forces shape the visible world. To modern eyes, it may seem chaotic and cruel. But to those who sat in judgment, it was a necessary defense against the devil himself. As Bridget Bishop's body was laid to rest in an unmarked grave, Salem settled uneasily into the reality of what had begun. The trials were no longer a threat on the horizon. They were here, unfolding daily. And with each passing week, the net would widen, the prisons would fill further, and the gallows would claim more lives. The trials had truly begun. Among all the features of the Salem Witch Trials, none was more controversial, more powerful, or more destructive than the use of spectral evidence. In simple terms, this was the testimony that a person's spirit, or spectre, had appeared to the afflicted and tormented them. The body of the accused might be standing quietly in the courtroom, but if a witness swore that their ghostly shape pinched, choked, or struck them in visions, this was accepted as evidence of guilt. To understand why such testimony carried weight, we must place ourselves in the world of 1692. The Puritans believed firmly in an unseen realm, as real and active as the visible one. Angels and demons were not distant concepts, but constant presences, shaping daily life. The devil was no symbol, he was a prowling enemy, seeking souls to devour. In such a world, the idea that a person's spirit could leave their body and do harm was not incredible. It was feared. The afflicted girls embodied this fear. They would fall into fits, shriek, or writhe on the floor, insisting that the spectre of a neighbor stood before them. They described claws, pinches, and choking hands. Sometimes they claimed to see shadowy animals, cats, birds, or wolves, sent by witches as familiars. In the charged atmosphere of the courtroom, their cries seemed undeniable proof. If so many young girls, from different households, told the same story, how could it be false? But the reliance on spectral evidence was not without its critics. Some ministers, including the respected Increase Mather, warned that the devil could take the shape of an innocent person. If this were true, then a blameless soul might appear guilty through no fault of their own. Cotton Mather, his son, argued more cautiously. Spectral evidence might be considered, but should not be the sole ground for conviction. Yet, in the heated climate of Salem, these warnings were easily drowned out. For the judges and many villagers, the afflicted girls' fits were persuasive. Their bodies convulsed, their voices changed, and their pain appeared real. To dismiss them entirely was to suggest fraud or imagination, which many found difficult to believe. And so, spectral evidence became the hinge on which trials turned. A neighbor's vision could outweigh a lifetime of piety. A child's cry could silence the testimony of respected elders. The effects were devastating. Once spectral evidence was admitted, almost no defense was possible. How could someone disprove an invisible assault? To deny it only fueled suspicion. If the afflicted cried out in the presence of the accused, it was taken as proof that their spirit was near. Silence, protest, or tears all seemed to confirm guilt in one way or another. The very act of standing trial was a trap from which escape was nearly impossible. We see this most clearly in the case of Rebecca Nurse. Elderly, devout, and respected, she stood accused largely because the afflicted claimed her spectre tormented them. Many villagers spoke in her defense, signing petitions and testifying to her good character. Yet when the girls shrieked in court, insisting they saw her ghost beside them, the magistrates wavered. Rebecca's denials could not erase the visions of the afflicted. Though she was briefly acquitted, pressure from the court and the public reversed the decision. In the end, spectral evidence sealed her fate. The reliance on such testimony also spread fear through the community. If the devil could make anyone's spectre appear guilty, then who was safe? Some wondered quietly whether the afflicted might be deceived, but few dared to say so openly. The girls' visions carried too much authority, and to question them risked accusation. Thus, spectral evidence not only convicted the accused, but silenced the doubtful. Still, cracks in the system began to appear. As the number of accused grew, some magistrates struggled with unease. Could it truly be that so many neighbors, many of them known for piety and uprightness, were witches? The more the afflicted pointed, the more fragile the basis of their accusation seemed. And yet, with no other clear path, the court pressed on, bound by its own decisions. It is important to remember that the Salem villagers were not foolish or irrational by their own standards. They lived in a world where illness, misfortune, and sudden death had few explanations. To them, invisible forces provided answers where medicine and science could not. Spectral evidence fit within this worldview. What appears incredible to us was, to them, part of the natural order. But even within that worldview, doubts grew. Some ministers urged caution in private letters. Others watched the trials with concern, noting that reliance on invisible proof risked condemning the innocent. These voices would eventually gain strength, but in the summer of 1692, the cries of the afflicted still held sway. Spectral evidence, more than any other factor, gave the trials their momentum. It expanded the circle of accusation far beyond what physical proof could support. It turned fear into certainty, suspicion into conviction, and it left the accused with little hope of escape. As the nooses tightened at Gallows Hill, and the jails filled with men and women awaiting trial, the weight of spectral testimony bore heavily on Salem. Invisible visions had become stronger than visible lives. And though doubts stirred beneath the surface, the community pressed forward, bound by the belief that the unseen world spoke through the afflicted. In time, this reliance on spectral evidence would be questioned, condemned, and abandoned. But in 1692, it was the voice of authority. It was the evidence that reached beyond the walls of the courtroom into the unseen realm of spirits. And it decided who would live and who would die. When we imagine the Salem Witch Trials, our minds often drift to the grim image of the gallows. A wooden frame rising on Gallows Hill, ropes swaying in the summer air, and neighbors gathered in a mixture of fear, curiosity, and grief. Here, the trials left behind the realm of words and entered the realm of death. It was at the gallows that suspicion became punishment, and accusation became execution. The first to meet this fate was Bridget Bishop on June 10, 1692. She was a woman of middle age, known for speaking her mind, dressing more brightly than custom allowed, and having been accused of witchcraft before. To her neighbors, she seemed a likely candidate for suspicion. Her trial was swift, and though she insisted on her innocence to the very end, she was condemned. On that June morning, she was led out of Salem town, past the watching eyes of villagers, to the hill where the gallows stood. She spoke no elaborate defense, only firm denials, as the rope was placed around her neck. When the trap gave way, she became the first victim of Salem's hanging tree. The gallows were not hidden away, but stood in full view of the town and countryside. Executions were public spectacles, meant to serve as both warning and confirmation. To many who watched, they were also troubling. If witches were truly being cut off, why did the executions not bring peace? Instead, each hanging seemed only to stir further unease. By July, the noose had claimed more lives. Sarah Good, remembered as a poor, wandering woman, met her end on July 19. She, too, denied being a witch, and according to one account, declared to Reverend Nicholas Noyes, at the foot of the gallows, "I am no more a witch than you are, and if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." Her words, whether legend or truth, lingered in Salem's memory long after. Alongside her that day died Rebecca Nurse, the elderly matron whose good reputation could not save her. For many, her execution was the most shocking of all. To see such a woman, pious, gentle, and beloved, swinging from the rope planted seeds of doubt that would grow in time. The gallows also took Susanna Martin, Elizabeth Howe, and Sarah Wilds, all executed that July day. With each death, the gravity of the trials deepened. Salem was not merely accusing witches, it was killing neighbors. August brought more. On August 19, George Burroughs, once the minister of Salem Village, was led to the hill. His presence there startled many. Ministers were seen as defenders against Satan, not agents of him. At the gallows, Burroughs prayed the Lord's Prayer with perfect clarity, something thought impossible for a witch. For a moment, the crowd stirred uneasily. Could an innocent man be about to die? Yet the judges pressed forward, and he was hanged, his prayer still echoing in the minds of those who watched. With him died Martha Carrier, John Proctor, George Jacobs Sir, and John Willard. By September, the executions reached their height. On September 22, 8 more were hanged: Mary Easty, Martha Corey, Ann Pediator, Alice Parker, Mary Parker, Wilmot Red, Margaret Scott, and Samuel Wardwell. This was the largest single day of executions in Salem. Among them was Martha Corey, once respected and once skeptical of the trials themselves. Her death sent a chilling message. Even those who questioned the court could not escape its reach. The gallows were not the only place of death. On September 19, Giles Corey met a different fate. Refusing to enter a plea, he was pressed to death with heavy stones in Salem town. His silence was a form of resistance, meant to preserve his property for his heirs. But his death was cruel beyond measure, as stones crushed his chest. He is said to have called only for more weight. His grim defiance haunted Salem as much as the hangings themselves. What was it like for those who gathered to watch these executions? Some came with fear, believing justice was being served and the devil's servants were being rooted out. Others came with sorrow, uneasy about the number and nature of the condemned. Still others came simply because public hangings were events, moments when the entire community paused to watch life and death unfold. Yet with every execution, Salem's conscience grew heavier. The gallows did not end the accusations. They did not cure the afflicted. Instead, they multiplied fear. The more people died, the more the afflicted cried out against new suspects. The shadow of the gallows spread across the village like a storm cloud, covering all in doubt, and so the gallows became both a stage and a symbol. A stage where accusations met their deadly end before the eyes of hundreds. A symbol of a community caught in the grip of its own fears, turning judgment into spectacle and doubt into death. Today, no trace of that wooden structure remains. Gallows Hill is quiet, its grass and trees hiding the memory of what once took place there. But in 1692, it was the darkest point of Salem, the place where fear became final, and where neighbors walked together up the hill, but returned alone. While the gallows claimed the condemned, many more endured long weeks and months in the jails of Essex County. These prisons, scattered across the region, became holding places for the accused as their trials dragged on. They were not designed for comfort or safety, but for confinement. For those who found themselves within their walls, life became a slow torment of fear, hardship, and uncertainty. At the time of the trials, Essex County had several small jails in Salem, Ipswich, Boston, and other towns. They were built of rough stone and timber, with barred windows and heavy doors. These were not large structures. They were modest lockups meant for petty criminals, debtors, or those awaiting brief trials. But in 1692, they filled with neighbors, friends, and kin accused of witchcraft. At one point, more than 100 people crowded into these spaces, straining their meager capacity. Conditions inside were harsh. The jails were cold in winter, stifling in summer, and damp throughout the year. Prisoners slept on hard floors or narrow boards, often without proper bedding. Food was sparse, and those confined depended largely on family members to bring meals, blankets, or clothing. Chains were sometimes fastened to ankles, especially for those considered most dangerous. Fees were charged for lodging, shackles, and even straw to lie upon. Many accused, already poor, faced crushing debts as a result. Families struggled under this burden to keep a loved one alive in jail. Relatives had to deliver food, firewood, and money to the jailer. For some, this meant selling livestock, land, or tools. Even those who believed their kin to be innocent felt the financial and social strain of association. The longer the trials continued, the heavier this toll became. Inside the jails, the atmosphere was heavy with despair. Some prisoners prayed constantly, seeking God's comfort. Others wept or fell into silence, fearing the noose. The uncertainty was perhaps the hardest weight to bear. Would their case ever come to trial? Would they be cleared, or would they march to Gallows Hill? Weeks stretched into months with no clear answers. Among those imprisoned was Sarah Osborne, one of the first accused. She never lived to stand trial, dying in the Boston jail in May 1692. Her death revealed the grim reality, even before conviction. Imprisonment itself could be a death sentence. The cold, the hunger, and the despair weakened the body and broke the spirit. The jails also became places of uneasy companionship. Neighbors who once passed each other in fields or at church now shared cramped cells. Old resentments sometimes surfaced, but so too did moments of solidarity. Those accused together often clung to one another for comfort, united by the fear of the rope. Some prayed aloud, others sang hymns softly in the darkness. In such conditions, even small kindnesses carried great weight. Children, too, were held in these prisons. The case of Dorcas Good, the young daughter of Sarah Good, is especially haunting. At only 4 or 5 years old, she was accused of witchcraft and confined for months. Reports say that by the time she was released, she was deeply traumatized, her childhood scarred beyond repair. The image of a child behind bars speaks to the extremity of Salem's panic. The jails were also filled with men, though women made up the majority of the accused. Farmers, ministers, and even respected elders found themselves shackled. George Jacobs, Sr., an elderly man with a cane, was seen by visitors sitting heavily chained. His advanced age offered no protection from suspicion or from the hardships of imprisonment. Even after executions began, the jails did not empty. Instead, more suspects poured in, sometimes arrested on the flimsiest of claims. The accused awaited their turn before the court, knowing that the longer they lingered, the weaker their bodies grew. Some prisoners confessed under pressure, hoping that admission might spare them the gallows. Others clung to their innocence, even as the weight of chains left bruises on their skin. The jailers themselves were often practical men. not driven by the passions of the trials but by their duties. They charged fees and recorded debts, treating the accused as ordinary prisoners. Yet even they must have sensed the peculiarity of their role, holding mothers, ministers, and children in cells meant for thieves or debtors. The line between law and hysteria blurred within their walls. When we think of the Salem trials, we often imagine the noisy courtroom or the solemn gallows. But the jails were just as central to the story. They were places of waiting, where fear fermented and hope dwindled. Each stone wall and barred door held not only bodies, but also the heavy silence of a community in crisis. In the end, some prisoners were freed as the trials collapsed. Others were released only after long months, their health broken, their lives forever marked. The jails had done their work, not only by confining, but by wearing down the spirit. Even those who survived carried scars invisible but deep. Today, little remains of these jails. Their stones have been scattered, their timbers lost, yet their memory lingers. For they remind us that the Salem trials were not only about the dramatic spectacle of hanging, but also about the quiet suffering of imprisonment. For every victim who died on Gallows Hill, many more endured the slow torment of waiting in chains, uncertain whether each dawn would be their last. By the summer of 1692, the machinery of accusation and trial had produced its grim result. Death sentences. The courts had heard the testimonies, weighed the supposed evidence, and declared that certain men and women were guilty of witchcraft. Now came the step that many had dreaded yet believed necessary: the executions. The first of these occurred on July 19, 1692, a bright day in Salem. Crowds gathered as 5 women were led from the jail to the place of execution, a rocky hill just outside of town. Today, we know it as Gallows Hill, though in 1692, it was simply an outcropping with a tree strong enough to hold a rope. The condemned walked in a solemn procession, watched closely by neighbors, strangers, and officials. Among them was Sarah Good, one of the earliest accused. Poor, often homeless, and disliked by many, she had long been seen as a troublemaker. Yet her final words were sharp and defiant. When urged to confess, she instead declared that she was no witch, and that God would give her accusers blood to drink. Her fierce spirit echoed across the hill as the rope tightened around her neck. With her walked Rebecca Nurse, an elderly woman known for her piety and kindness. Her conviction had shocked many, for she had lived a long life of faith and service. Yet the court had found her guilty, and the sentence was carried out. Witnesses said she faced her death with remarkable composure, her calmness contrasting with the cries of the crowd. Beside her was Susanna Martin, known for her sharp wit and independence. To some, these qualities had marked her as troublesome. To others, they were simply the signs of a strong woman. She denied the charge until the end, declaring her innocence firmly. But the rope silenced her voice. Also executed that day were Elizabeth Howe and Sarah Wilders, both of whom had long been subjects of whispered suspicion in their communities. Old grudges, quarrels with neighbors, and the misfortunes of livestock had grown into accusations of witchcraft. At Gallows Hill, these resentments found their deadly conclusion. The hangings were conducted in public, as was the custom of the time. Executions were meant to be seen, to serve as warnings to others. Children, farmers, merchants, and ministers all stood together, watching as their neighbors swung from the tree. For some, it was a solemn duty, the purging of evil from their midst. For others, it was a moment of unease, a chilling spectacle that raised quiet doubts. After the bodies were cut down, they were denied burial in consecrated ground. Instead, they were placed in shallow graves near the hill, or reclaimed secretly by grieving family members. To die as a witch meant not only death, but also the loss of honor, a separation even in death from the community. These first executions cast a long shadow over Salem. Until that point, accusations and trials had carried the air of theater and fear. But now they carried the weight of finality. People realized that the court would not hesitate to enforce its rulings. The rope was no longer a threat but a reality. In August, the executions continued. On the 19th of that month, 5 more went to the gallows, including the former minister George Burroughs. His case was especially shocking. A man of education and faith, he had once served as pastor in Salem Village. Though later dismissed, he remained respected by some. At the gallows, he recited the Lord's Prayer, something many believed a witch could not do. Those watching were stirred. Some even doubted the justice of his sentence. Yet the rope tightened nonetheless, and Burroughs died among the accused. With him perished Martha Carrier, a woman whose bold defiance in court had earned her the label, Queen of Hell, from the accusers. She had spoken fiercely against the proceedings, refusing to bend to pressure. Her strength unnerved many, but it also inspired quiet admiration. Even in chains, she remained unyielding. Others executed that August day included John Proctor, a farmer known for his outspoken criticism of the trials. He had argued that the court was misguided, and for this, suspicion fell upon him. His death showed that even respected men could be destroyed if they dared to question the panic. Alongside him were George Jacobs, Sr., an elderly man who struggled to stand as he was led to the rope, and John Willard, a former constable who had turned against the prosecutions. These executions deepened the fear that spread through Essex County. If ministers, respected elders, and outspoken farmers could hang, then no one was truly safe. At the same time, murmurs of disquiet grew louder. Some began to wonder if the court had gone too far. Yet few dared to speak openly, for fear that doubt itself might be seen as sympathy for witches. By September, the hangings reached their grim peak. On the 22nd of that month, 8 more were executed. Among them was Martha Corey, whose husband, Giles, would soon meet a terrible fate of his own. Martha had been a full church member, once considered above suspicion. Her death underscored how far the panic had spread, reaching even into the heart of Salem's pious families. That same day saw the deaths of Mary Easty, the sister of Rebecca Nurse, and several others whose names, once ordinary, became forever bound to this dark chapter of history. The gallows worked steadily, claiming life after life. Each execution brought both closure and dread, for while one case ended, many more accusations were already rising. For the people of Salem, the hangings were a spectacle of both fear and doubt. Some saw justice, others saw tragedy, but all felt the weight of the rope's shadow. The tree at Gallows Hill bore not only bodies, but also the heavy burden of a community caught between faith and fear, justice and hysteria. Among all the deaths of the Salem Witch Trials, none is remembered with such horror and fascination as that of Giles Corey. His passing was not by rope, as with so many others, but by a method rarely seen in New England, pressing under heavy stones. The image of an old man slowly crushed beneath increasing weight has lingered in memory, not only for its brutality, but also for the courage he displayed in his final moments. Giles Corey was in his early 80s in 1692, a remarkable age for that time. He was a farmer of some standing in Salem Village. Known for his stubborn nature and sharp tongue, he was not without controversy. Years earlier, he had been accused of beating a servant to death, a charge that left his reputation marred. He was also a man who quarreled easily with neighbors. Yet he was no outcast. He owned land, had a family, and was woven into the life of the community. When his wife Martha Corey was accused of witchcraft, Giles initially showed skepticism toward her innocence. But as the accusations multiplied and the evidence grew stranger, he began to see the folly of the trials. In time, he himself was accused, charged with the same crime that had doomed so many others. When brought before the court, Giles made a decision that set him apart from the rest. He refused to enter a plea of guilty or not guilty. According to English law, a trial could not proceed without a plea. By staying silent, Giles placed himself outside the process. Some say he did this to protect his family's land. A conviction for witchcraft would have meant the confiscation of his property. But by refusing to plead, he ensured that his estate would pass to his heirs. Whatever his motives, his silence forced the court into a grim alternative. The punishment for refusing to plead was known as peine forte dure, strong and hard punishment. It was rarely used in the colonies, for most accused eventually spoke, but Giles remained steadfast. The law demanded that he be pressed with heavy stones until he either entered a plea or died. And so the sentence was prepared. On September 19, 1692, in a field near Salem, Giles Corey was led out and stripped of his clothing. He was laid upon the ground, a board placed across his chest. Then, one by one, heavy stones were set upon the board, the weight pressed down, slowly crushing his chest and making it hard to breathe. Witnesses recorded that he endured this punishment with remarkable composure. As more stones were added, and as his body strained under the weight, he spoke only 2 words: more weight. The phrase has echoed through history, a defiance that seems to capture both his stubborn spirit and his refusal to bend to injustice. For 2 days, Giles endured the pressing. The sheriff, George Corwin, oversaw the punishment, urging him to enter a plea. Neighbors and bystanders watched in horror as the stones mounted. Yet Giles never spoke the words they demanded. He neither confessed nor denied. He offered only silence, and his final, defiant request for more weight. At last, his body could endure no more. Crushed beneath the stones, Giles Corey died. His death was both a tragedy and a spectacle, a reminder of how far the trials had strayed from ordinary justice. Even those who believed in witchcraft were unsettled by the cruelty of pressing an old man to death. His wife Martha, still imprisoned, would be hanged just 3 days later, on September 22nd, alongside 7 others. Thus the Coreys, husband and wife, became among the most famous victims of the trials. She by the rope, he by the stones. The death of Giles Corey carried weight beyond the physical. In his refusal to plead, he exposed the court's brutality and preserved his family's inheritance. His silence became a form of protest, a resistance that no rope or chain could break. Some later saw him as a kind of martyr, not only for his family, but for the principle that the court's authority could be defied. Legends soon grew around his name. Some claimed that before his death, Giles uttered a curse upon Salem and upon Sheriff Corwin, predicting ruin for the town and misfortune for the sheriff's family. Stories spread that Corwin himself later suffered strange ailments, or that shadows of Giles appeared near the jail. Whether true or not, such tales reflect how deeply his death haunted the community. For the people of Salem, the pressing was a turning point. Until then, the executions, while grim, had followed familiar patterns. Hangings were public, orderly, and justified as necessary punishments. But the crushing of an old man beneath stones shocked many. It revealed not only the cruelty of the law, but also the desperation of the court to enforce obedience. In the years that followed, Giles Corey's name became a symbol of resistance. Writers and historians remembered his more weight, as a cry against tyranny. His death was retold in sermons, books, and plays, casting him as both victim and hero. Even today, the image of an aged farmer standing silent before his accusers, enduring the stones with grim determination, continues to stir imagination. Yet behind the legend was a man, flawed, stubborn, and human. Giles Corey was no saint, but in his final hours, he found a kind of courage that outlasted the panic of Salem. His death marked not just the crushing of a body, but the breaking point of a community's hysteria. When we remember Salem, we often picture the gallows on the hill. But alongside them stands the image of Giles Corey, lying in the dirt, stones pressing down, his voice rasping out two words that have never been forgotten: more weight. The Salem Witch Trials reached their darkest climax on September 22nd, 1692, when the gallows claimed their final victims. The sun rose over Salem as 8 prisoners were led from their cells, bound for Gallows Hill. By this point, the town had seen months of accusations, examinations, trials, and executions. Yet the sight of so many being marched together to their deaths carried a weight heavier than any that had come before. Among those condemned that day was Martha Corey, wife of Giles Corey. Only 3 days earlier, Giles had died under the crushing weight of stones, refusing to plead before the court. Now Martha faced her own end. She had been a respected church member before the accusations, a woman of deep faith who had initially questioned the reliability of the afflicted girls. That skepticism made her a target. On the gallows, she met her fate with composure, her quiet dignity standing in contrast to the cruelty of her sentence. Also executed was Mary Easty, sister of Rebecca Nurse. Both sisters had lived lives marked by piety and service, yet both were destroyed by the hysteria. Mary's petition to the court remains one of the most moving documents of the period. In it, she did not beg for her own life, but instead pleaded for an end to the shedding of innocent blood. Her words went unheeded, and she mounted the gallows with courage. Another to die that day was Alice Parker, a woman known in Salem town for her sharp tongue. Neighbors had accused her of bewitching ships and cattle, charges rooted more in rumor than in evidence. Yet, like the others, she was convicted and condemned. Her defiance in court carried into her final hours, for she proclaimed her innocence until the rope silenced her. Ann Perdita, a widow in her 70s, was also among the group. She had worked as a nurse and midwife, professions that often attracted suspicion during times of fear. Accusations against her ranged from poisoning to causing deaths in childbirth. Her advanced age and respected role in the community did not save her. On Gallows Hill, she stood as proof that even the elderly and experienced were not spared. The gallows also claimed Wilmot Red of Marblehead, remembered as outspoken and difficult. Her neighbors had long whispered about her, calling her Mammy Red with disdain. During her trial, little evidence beyond gossip was offered, yet it was enough to seal her fate. She, too, died that September morning. Margaret Scott of Rowley, another elderly widow, joined the group. Like many widows, she lived on the margins of society, dependent on neighbors' goodwill. Accusations of witchcraft had followed her for years, fueled by her poverty and her reliance on others. Now, at the end of her life, those whispers became ropes. The last of the 8 was Samuel Wardwell of Andover. Unlike many of the women, he was a man of some means, known for fortune, telling in his younger days. At first, under pressure, he confessed to witchcraft, but later recanted, declaring his innocence. His wavering confession counted against him, and the court condemned him nonetheless. His death showed how dangerous it was to confess and then withdraw. The court saw such acts as proof of deception, As the 8 stood beneath the hanging tree, the atmosphere was somber. By now, the townspeople had witnessed enough executions to know the sight well. But the sheer number of victims that day, combined with the memory of Giles Corey's pressing only days before, created a sense of deep unease. Ministers urged repentance. The condemned proclaimed innocence, and one by one they were hanged. When the bodies were cut down, they were again denied burial in consecrated ground. Their remains were left in shallow graves, or carried away secretly by loved ones who dared to risk the anger of authorities. Family members whispered prayers over hastily covered earth, mourning in silence what the law had declared shameful. The hangings of September 22nd marked the last executions of the Salem Witch Trials. In total, 19 people were hanged at Gallows Hill between July and September, and one, Giles Corey, was pressed to death. Others had already died in prison. The toll was staggering for a small community, and the events left scars that would not soon fade. After this grim day, the tide began to turn. Doubts that had been whispered now grew louder. The death of respected figures like Martha Corey and Mary Eastie, combined with the gruesome end of Giles Corey, shook the confidence of many. Some ministers began to question the validity of spectral evidence. Prominent citizens voiced unease. The certainty that had fueled the court's work began to crumble. But for the victims of September 22nd, such doubts came too late. Their names, once ordinary in the life of Essex County, became bound forever to the tragedy of Salem. Mothers, widows, farmers, and church members, all were swept up in the storm, and all met the rope. As autumn deepened, the gallows stood silent. The executions had ended, though the prisons remained crowded. Salem itself seemed hushed, as if the town had exhausted its fury, and now felt the weight of its deeds. The image of 8 figures, hanging in the sunlight, lingered in memory, a final, haunting vision of how fear had triumphed over reason. For us today, the last hangings are a reminder of how far the panic had spread and how much it had cost. They show us not only the cruelty of the trials, but also the humanity of those who stood on the gallows, proclaiming innocence in the face of death. Their voices, though silenced, continue to speak. Across the centuries, across the silence of history, warning of what happens when fear overcomes justice. The executions of September 22nd, 1692, left a silence in Salem heavier than the autumn air. With 8 more souls hanged on Gallows Hill, and Giles Corey pressed to death only days before, the community had reached a breaking point. What had begun months earlier, with whispered fears and strange fits, now stood revealed as a grim spectacle of death. For the first time, doubt began to take hold, not in private murmurs alone, but in public words. The tide was turning. At the heart of the trials stood the use of spectral evidence. The testimony of the afflicted girls who claimed to see invisible shapes and spirits tormenting them. For months, the judges had accepted such visions as proof, even when no physical evidence could be found. It was this reliance on the unseen that had sent respected church members like Martha Corey and Rebecca Nurse to their deaths. Yet after so many executions, some began to question whether invisible spirits could truly serve as the foundation of justice. Prominent ministers voiced concern. Increase Mather, the respected father of Cotton Mather, published words that carried weight throughout Massachusetts. He declared that it was better for 10 suspected witches to go free than for one innocent person to be condemned. His statement did not dismiss the reality of witchcraft outright. Belief in the devil's work was still strong, but it urged caution, restraint, and a greater demand for solid proof. In a town that had seen too much blood, these words found receptive ears. Even among the judges themselves, uncertainty stirred. Judge Samuel Sewall, once firm in his role, began to feel unease about the course the court had taken. Others worried that they had leaned too heavily on the cries of the afflicted. They began to see how accusations, once unleashed, could not be contained. Entire families had been swept into prison. Children, neighbors, and respected elders had all been named. If the trials continued unchecked, who would be safe? The families of the condemned also spoke. The petitions of men like Francis Nurse, who pleaded for his wife Rebecca's innocence, continued to circulate. The dignified words of Mary Eastey's petition, written before her death, echoed in the minds of those who read it. She had asked not for her own life, but for the court to reconsider its methods, so that no more innocent blood would be shed. Now that she was gone, her words seemed prophetic. The afflicted girls, too, began to lose some of their authority. In the early months, their fits and cries had been enough to sway entire rooms. But as the number of the accused grew, people began to notice contradictions in their stories. When they cried out against individuals of high standing, or against those whose lives had long been considered blameless, the trust placed in them began to waver. What once inspired fear now provoked suspicion. Another factor was the spread of accusations beyond Salem village. Families in nearby towns, such as Andover, found themselves caught in the net. Entire households were questioned. Mothers and daughters shackled together, fathers hauled away in chains. For those communities, the trials no longer seemed a distant drama, but a present danger. As fear spread outward, so too did resistance. By October, Governor William Phipps, who had been away overseeing military matters, returned to Massachusetts. He was shocked by what he found. Though he had initially supported the court, the sheer scale of the accusations and the doubts now being voiced convinced him that something must change. At last, he stepped in to halt further executions and to place tighter limits on the court's powers. The turning of the tide did not happen overnight. The prisons remained full. Trials continued in some form, and accusations still lingered. But the frenzy that had driven the hangings and the pressing began to cool. Public confidence in the afflicted was shaken. Ministers urged caution. Families whispered their grief. Salem itself seemed exhausted, as though the fire of hysteria had burned too hot and now struggled to keep its flame. In taverns and meeting houses, people spoke more freely of their doubts. Some began to regret their roles in the accusations, realizing that neighborly grudges, family feuds, and long-held suspicions had been given too much power. Others feared divine judgment, wondering if the blood of innocents cried out against them. For a town once united in its pursuit of witches, Salem now stood divided, uncertain and heavy with guilt. The change was slow, but it was real. Where once the sound of gallows, building and prison doors echoed through the air, now there was a growing quiet. The people of Salem had seen 19 hanged, 1 pressed, and many more shackled in cold cells. They had seen respected church members die alongside outcasts. They had heard prayers cut short by the snap of ropes. Now, at last, they began to ask, had it all been a terrible mistake? History would answer that question, but in the autumn of 1692, the people of Salem did not yet know what lay ahead. They only knew that something in the air had shifted. The certainty that had fueled the court was gone. In its place was unease, hesitation, and the first stirrings of remorse. The tide was turning, and though the trials were not yet over, their power had begun to wane. As autumn deepened in 1692, Salem found itself in a strange silence. The gallows stood unused, yet the prisons remained crowded. Families mourned in whispers. The cries of the afflicted girls were still heard, but no longer with the same authority. Something had shifted. Out of this uneasy stillness, voices began to rise. Voices that questioned, resisted, and denounced the court that had once seemed unassailable. One of the most significant voices was that of Increase Mather, the respected minister of Boston and father of Cotton Mather. Though Cotton had been an ardent supporter of the trials, Increase was more cautious. In his book Cases of Conscience Concerning Evil Spirits, published that very year, he argued that reliance on spectral evidence was a dangerous path. To convict someone solely on the visions of others, he warned, was to risk condemning the innocent. His statement that it was better that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned spread quickly. It struck at the heart of the court's logic and provided a foundation for others to speak out. Other ministers joined this chorus of doubt. Samuel Willard, pastor of Boston's South Church, also voiced concerns, urging that justice must be built on firm and visible evidence. These men did not deny the existence of witchcraft. Few in that time could. But they called for caution, for restraint, and for reason in place of frenzy. Their words carried great weight, for ministers shaped the conscience of the community. In Salem and the surrounding towns, families of the accused raised their voices as well. Petitions circulated, pleading for the release of those still imprisoned. Husbands, wives, and children begged the authorities to reconsider the accusations. Many had already lost loved ones to the rope, yet they found the courage to speak on behalf of those who remained. These petitions, often signed by dozens of neighbors, carried a power that could not easily be ignored. Among the people themselves, doubts began to surface more openly. Farmers and tradesmen, who had once nodded along with the cries of the afflicted, now began to shake their heads. Whispers of regret spread. Regret for testimony given too hastily, for grudges allowed to sway judgment, for fear that had silenced reason. Some who had joined in the accusations now feared they had blood on their hands. Even the afflicted girls, once untouchable, faced skepticism. When they cried out against individuals of unquestioned reputation, such as the wives of ministers or wealthy merchants, some began to see the accusations less as visions from God and more as inventions of frightened or ambitious children. The spell of their authority was breaking. Judges, too, felt the change. Samuel Sewall, one of the magistrates, later confessed publicly to his guilt in condemning the innocent. But even before that formal confession, he and others began to feel the unease of what they had done. The sheer number of accusations had spiraled far beyond control. Entire villages like Andover had been swept up, with scores of people arrested. The trials no longer seemed like the careful work of justice, but a wild storm devouring everything in its path. The voice of Governor William Phips also entered the debate. On his return from military campaigns, he found a colony consumed by fear and suspicion. Though he had initially empowered the special court, he now saw the damage it had wrought. With the support of ministers like Increase Mather, he began to restrict the use of spectral evidence and to call for moderation. His authority gave new strength to the rising opposition. Outside Salem, dissent grew stronger still. Towns like Boston, less entangled in the frenzy, watched with alarm as the trials expanded. Merchants, ministers, and ordinary citizens questioned whether such proceedings reflected justice or only panic. Pamphlets circulated, sermons were preached, and conversations in taverns turned critical. The trials, once seen as the work of righteousness, now appeared to many as a stain upon the colony. For the accused who still languished in prison, these voices of dissent offered the first glimmer of hope. Shackled in dark, cold cells, they heard rumors of petitions and protests, of ministers questioning the court, of neighbors daring to speak their names with compassion rather than condemnation. Though the walls of the jail remained firm, the walls of belief outside were beginning to crack. It is easy, from our perspective, to wonder why these voices did not rise sooner. Why did they wait until after so many had died? But fear is a powerful silencer. To question the trials in their height was to risk being accused oneself. Only when the frenzy began to falter, when the sheer weight of bloodshed became undeniable, did enough courage gather to break the silence. And yet, when the voices came, they mattered. They turned the tide of public opinion. They gave the hesitant a reason to speak, the doubtful a reason to stand, and the grieving a reason to hope. Step by step, Salem was moving away from the gallows. Though the shadow of what had already been done would never vanish, the voices of dissent remind us that hysteria cannot last forever. Fear may dominate for a time, but eventually reason, compassion, and conscience begin to stir. In Salem, those stirrings began in late 1692. As ministers, judges, families, and neighbors found their voices once more. Their words could not bring back the dead, but they could begin the long work of ending the trials and of healing a wounded community. By the close of 1692, Salem was wary. The air no longer hummed with the same fevered cries that had once filled the meeting house. Instead, it was heavy with silence, broken only by the low murmur of regret and the soft rattle of chains in the crowded jails. Nearly 24 people had been executed, and many more still languished behind bars. Yet even the most fearful villagers now began to ask the same question. How much longer could this go on? The change came from above, and it came with the firm hand of Governor William Phips. He had been absent for much of the early hysteria, occupied with military campaigns against the French and their native allies in the north. When he returned to Massachusetts in late summer, he found a colony torn apart, its daily life consumed by suspicion, accusation, and death. At first, he had trusted the court of Oyer and Terminer, the special tribunal he himself had authorized to bring order. But as the accusations spread and the number of condemned grew, his confidence faltered. Reports reached him that people of high standing, respected ministers' wives, wealthy merchants, even officials connected to his own government, were now being accused. The trials were no longer limited to the marginalized or the troublesome. They threatened the very fabric of the colony's leadership. What had begun as a hunt for hidden evil had become a whirlwind consuming all in its path. By October, the pressure to act was immense. Increase Mather's warnings against spectral evidence echoed across the colony. Petitions for the release of prisoners circulated, gathering signatures from neighbors brave enough to risk their names. Families of the condemned traveled long miles to Boston, pleading for justice. Even some of the judges began to hesitate, unsure if the evidence they had relied upon was sound. On October 29, 1692, Governor Phips took the decisive step. He ordered the court of Oyer and Terminer dissolved. No more trials would be conducted under its authority. The news spread quickly, carrying with it a mix of relief, confusion, and quiet joy. Though the prisons remained full and no executions were yet reversed, the machinery of death had finally ground to a halt. In its place, a new court was established, the Superior Court of Judicature. Unlike its predecessor, this body was instructed to disregard spectral evidence, the very testimony that had fueled the frenzy. Without it, the cases against most accused witches collapsed. Juries grew reluctant to convict, and one by one, prisoners began to find their way home. But in Salem Village, The scars remained fresh. The gallows on Gallows Hill still stood as a grim reminder. Families who had buried their loved ones knew that no decree from Boston could erase their loss. The names of Rebecca Nurse, Martha Carrier, and George Burroughs were whispered with sorrow in households across Essex County. The collapse of the court might have stopped the hangings, but it could not stop the grief. For those still imprisoned, the governor's order brought hope, but not immediate freedom. Many remained in chains for weeks, or even months longer, waiting for the slow wheels of the new court to turn. Some were released only after paying heavy fees to cover the cost of their imprisonment. A final insult after months of suffering. Others faced the bitter reality that though freed, their reputations were shattered. In small Puritan communities, suspicion lingered long after the legal verdicts were reversed. Yet, for the colony as a whole, Phipps's decision marked a turning point. The fear that had once seemed irresistible began to recede. With no more executions to stoke the fire, reason slowly reclaimed ground. Farmers returned to their fields, merchants to their shops, and ministers to their pulpits. Ordinary life, though scarred, began to resume. The end of the court also carried deeper lessons. It revealed how fragile justice could be when clouded by fear, and how quickly reason could be drowned out by cries of the crowd. But it also showed the power of dissent, the courage of ministers who questioned, of families who petitioned, and of a governor who, however late, chose to act. On quiet evenings that winter, Salem's meeting houses no longer echoed with accusations. Instead, they rang with sermons calling for repentance and healing. Ministers urged forgiveness, reminding their flocks that the devil's greatest victory was not in the alleged witches, but in the hatred and suspicion that had torn neighbor from neighbor. The gallows would never again be used for witchcraft in Massachusetts. Though superstition lingered, and though whispers of the devil did not vanish overnight, the colony had turned away from the path of blood. The court of Oyer and Terminer, once the instrument of fear, became a cautionary memory, a story to be told with regret rather than pride. So it was that in the final months of 1692, Salem stepped back from the brink. The storm that had begun with a handful of frightened girls and the trembling testimony of neighbors had ended, not with triumph, but with exhaustion and shame. The end of the court was not the end of the pain. That would take years, even generations. But it was the first step toward healing. And in that moment, as the gallows stood unused and the prisons slowly emptied, Salem learned a lesson that echoes still, that fear can build a court, but only truth and courage can bring it down. When Governor Phipps dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer in October of 1692, the hangings stopped. The gallows on Gallows Hill stood empty, and the chilling rhythm of executions finally ceased. But for dozens of men and women, life did not return to normal. They remained behind the thick stone walls of the jails in Salem, Ipswich, Boston, and Cambridge, bound by chains and weighed down by debts they could not pay. For them, freedom was not yet a certainty. The prisons of Essex County were grim places. Dark, drafty, and often damp, they were built more to restrain than to sustain. Straw served as bedding, and thin rations of bread and water kept the prisoners alive but weak. Families often had to bring food and clothing to prevent their loved ones from starving or freezing. For months, some prisoners had clung to faint hope while executions claimed their neighbors. Now, though the gallows were quiet, their chains reminded them that their ordeal was not over. Among the most notable of these captives was Dorothy Good, the 5-year-old daughter of Sarah Good, who had been executed that summer. Little Dorothy had been imprisoned for months, accused of witchcraft on the strength of her childish words. Though she was eventually released, the time in jail left deep scars, and she never fully recovered from the trauma. Her story became one of the most haunting examples of how far the hysteria had gone. Others remained in confinement well into 1693. Many had already lost everything: property seized, farms abandoned, reputations ruined. Even those who survived the trials would emerge to find their homes in disarray and their communities suspicious of them. To be accused of witchcraft, even if later cleared, was a mark that could not easily be erased. The shift in legal proceedings, brought by the new Superior Court of Judicature, offered hope, but progress was slow. When the court convened in January 1693, it faced a backlog of cases, without spectral evidence. The testimony against most accused collapsed quickly. Jurors, perhaps chastened by the summer's bloodshed, hesitated to convict. Dozens of prisoners were acquitted or discharged. The tide had turned, but the wheels of justice creaked forward at a painful pace. In February, Governor Phipps issued a general pardon for many of the accused still awaiting trial. For some, this meant immediate release. For others, it meant the lifting of charges, but not necessarily freedom. Prisoners were often required to pay their jail fees, the costs of food, lodging, and chains, before they could walk out. For families already impoverished, these fees were devastating. A cruel irony lingered. Many who had been unjustly imprisoned now had to purchase their way out of bondage. Some, broken by months in confinement, died before they could leave. The records mention several who perished in the jails, their names less well remembered than those who swung from the gallows, but no less tragic. Their graves, often unmarked, were the final testament to how far the panic had reached. Outside the prison walls, families and neighbors worked tirelessly to bring loved ones home. Petitions continued to circulate, now calling for mercy and forgiveness, rather than demanding new arrests. Communities that had once been quick to condemn were learning, slowly, to acknowledge their mistakes. Though bitterness and division remained, the tone had shifted. Compassion was returning, however cautiously. For the released prisoners, life after jail was not simple. Returning to a village where neighbors had testified against you required a strength few could muster. Some moved away, seeking a fresh start in towns less haunted by the trials. Others stayed, living quietly under the shadow of suspicion. Children who had watched parents dragged to prison grew up carrying the memory, shaping a generation marked by loss and fear. In Salem village itself, the meeting house that had once echoed with the cries of the afflicted grew quieter. The afflicted girls who had held such power now found themselves questioned, even shunned. Some slipped into obscurity. Others lived long enough to express regret. Their voices, once the fuel of the frenzy, faded into silence. The last prisoners trickled home through the first half of 1693. Each release marked another small step away from hysteria and toward healing. Yet, for every freed captive, there was also a lingering wound, a home broken, a reputation shattered, or a family forever divided. Salem was no longer the same village it had been before that winter of strange fits in Reverend Parris's household. It bore scars visible and invisible, carried by every soul who had lived through the storm. By the summer of 1693, the jails were mostly empty of accused witches. The special court had been disbanded, the Superior Court had acquitted most, and the governor had issued pardons. The machinery of persecution had finally stopped, but the memory of the prisoners, men and women, old and young, guilty of nothing more than fear and misfortune, remained in the minds of those who had witnessed their suffering. The end of the trials did not mean the end of their story. In the years to come, petitions for justice and compensation would be filed, apologies would be made, and ministers would wrestle with their own consciences. But in those first months of 1693, the simple act of walking out of a prison cell, of stepping into the cold New England air as a free soul, was miracle enough. The last prisoners carried with them a silent truth that the true chains of Salem were not iron or stone, but fear and suspicion. When those chains finally broke, a community could begin, however slowly, to heal. When the last of the accused trickled out of the jails in 1693, Salem might have seemed ready to move on. The executions had ended. The prisons had emptied. The courts had shifted their course. Yet the village was not at peace. Instead, it was haunted. Haunted not by witches, but by memory, silence, and guilt. The trials had left behind more than unmarked graves. They had fractured families, splintered friendships, and cast long shadows across every household. In Salem village, every lane carried whispers, and every hearth carried scars. People had lost spouses, children, parents, and neighbors to the noose or the dungeon. Those who survived lived with the knowledge that they had once pointed fingers, or remained silent when accusations spread. It was not easy to resume ordinary life. Farmers returned to their fields, but many fields lay overgrown from months of neglect. Merchants reopened their shops, but trade was slower than before, for trust was hard to rebuild. Children laughed in the lanes, but some were orphans, their laughter carrying an edge of sorrow. The rhythm of daily life resumed, yet under it all pulsed unease. Like a wound that had closed but not healed, the meeting house, once the center of accusation and testimony, now became a place of uneasy gathering. Reverend Samuel Parris, whose household had first sparked the alarm, continued to preach. But his words no longer carried unquestioned weight. Many blamed him for encouraging the use of spectral evidence and for fanning the flames of fear. Petitions soon circulated, demanding his removal. Though he resisted for years, Parris eventually left Salem, his reputation damaged beyond repair. His departure was not just the end of a ministry, but a symbol of how deeply the trials had discredited once trusted leaders. For the afflicted girls, life after the hysteria was complex. Anne Putnam Jr., one of the most vocal accusers, returned to quiet village life. Years later, she publicly admitted that she had been deceived by Satan and had wronged many innocent people. Others, like Mercy Lewis and Mary Walcott, married and moved away, carrying their secrets with them. Their power, once so great that it sent neighbors to the gallows, faded into silence. But the memory of their cries lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed them. The families of the executed carried the heaviest burdens: the Goods, the Proctors, the Norses, the Coreys. Names once respected, now marked with grief. Some sought to clear their loved ones' names, filing petitions in later years for exoneration. Others remained quiet, worn down by sorrow. The memory of seeing a mother, a father, or a spouse led away in chains could not be erased. No matter how many pardons were signed, even those who had escaped execution bore the weight of suspicion. To have been accused was to live forever under a shadow. Neighbors who once gossiped now avoided eye contact. Business deals were harder to secure. Marriages were harder to arrange. The accusation itself lingered like a stain, long after the court had declared innocence. The broader community, too, felt the haunting. Other towns in Massachusetts looked at Salem with unease. What had begun as a small outbreak of fear had grown into a frenzy that cost 19 lives on the gallows, crushed one man beneath stones, and imprisoned more than 100. It was a stain on the colony's conscience, a reminder of how quickly justice could be twisted by fear. Ministers across New England reflected on the trials with discomfort. Some, like Increase Mather, had spoken against spectral evidence by the end, cautioning that it was better for 10 witches to go free than for one innocent person to be condemned. Others had remained silent, or worse, had encouraged the court. In the years that followed, sermons often carried a quiet undertone of regret. Congregations, too, learned to question rather than to follow blindly. Yet for all the sorrow, the healing was slow. Public acknowledgement of wrongdoing did not come quickly. In the 1690s, most were not ready to admit that they had been swept up in error. Too much pride, too much fear of shame held them back. Instead, people chose silence. The dead were mourned quietly. The mistakes whispered about behind closed doors. Salem was haunted less by ghosts than by silence. The silence of neighbors who could not bring themselves to speak of what they had done or failed to do. Children who had grown up during the trials carried the memories into adulthood. They remembered the cries in the meeting house, the sight of neighbors shackled, the empty chairs at supper. These memories shaped a generation wary of hysteria, but also wary of trust. For some, the lesson was caution. For others, bitterness. Salem's haunting would not fade in one season. It would live on in the hearts of those who had seen justice twisted into cruelty. And yet, amidst the sorrow, there were small acts of renewal. Crops were planted again. Marriages were celebrated. Babies were born. The community, however fractured, continued on. People found ways to laugh again, even if laughter was sometimes followed by silence. Life did not end in Salem, but it was forever changed. The haunted community of Salem carried two truths at once. On the surface, it returned to ordinary colonial life: farming, worship, trade, and family. Beneath the surface, it carried scars that could not be spoken aloud. It was a village that had looked into the mirror of fear and seen what it was capable of. And it could not forget. In the years ahead, petitions, apologies, and compensation would bring partial healing. But in the immediate aftermath, what Salem carried was not yet reconciliation, only memory. Memory of gallows and chains, of prayers and cries, of friends turned against friends. A memory that lingered like a shadow at the edge of every hearth. And so, though the trials had ended, Salem was haunted still. By the mid-1690s, the gallows stood empty, the jails had released their captives, and the frenzy of accusations had ceased. Yet the story of the Salem Witch Trials was not over. It lingered, in whispered memories, in wounded families, in sermons and petitions, and in the uneasy conscience of an entire colony. To live in Salem after 1692 was to live in the shadow of a lesson written in grief. The people of Massachusetts did not forget easily. For years, families who had lost loved ones sought to clear their names. In 1697, a day of fasting and prayer was declared, a public acknowledgement that the trials had been a grievous error. On that day, Reverend Samuel Parris stood before his congregation and confessed that mistakes had been made. Though his words fell short of the full apology many longed to hear. Other ministers prayed with more humility, asking God to forgive the colony for its sins. Petitions for justice continued into the early 1700s. Families like the Proctors, the nurses, and the Correys submitted formal requests to have their relatives' names cleared. Over time, the General Court of Massachusetts responded. In 1711, a bill was passed that granted compensation to many of the families of the executed. It was not a perfect act. Not every family received restitution, and money could not heal the wounds of grief. But it was a step toward recognition. The legacy of those accused and executed became more than private sorrow. It became a cautionary tale for generations to come. Ministers and magistrates looked back on Salem with unease, aware of how fear and pride had led them astray. Spectral evidence, once accepted, was now widely rejected. Courts became more cautious, insisting on clearer proof before condemning lives. The lesson was written into law as well as memory. Never again should suspicion outweigh justice. Some of the afflicted themselves came to reckon with what had happened. In 1706, Anne Putnam Junga, who as a young girl had been one of the most active accusers, stood before her congregation and publicly asked forgiveness. She admitted that she had been misled by the devil, that her accusations had cost innocent lives. Her words were heavy with regret, a rare moment when one of the central figures openly confessed the harm she had caused. For many, her apology was both a comfort and a sorrow, a reminder of what had been lost, and of the innocence of youth twisted into tragedy. For others, silence was the only legacy. Many of the accusers never spoke of the trials again. They lived out their lives quietly, perhaps unwilling or unable to face what their words had unleashed. The silence itself became part of the haunting, as generations grew up in a community reluctant to name its own history aloud. As decades passed, the story of Salem became less about individual names and more about what it revealed of human nature. Fear had sparked suspicion. Suspicion had fueled accusation. Authority had given sanction, and ordinary people had gone along. In the end, the lesson of Salem was not about witches at all, but about the dangers of hysteria, the frailty of justice, and the heavy cost of forgetting mercy. By the time the American colonies moved toward independence in the 18th century, Salem's story was already remembered as a warning. Writers and ministers drew upon it when speaking of liberty and justice, using it as an example of what happens when unchecked power meets unexamined fear. The gallows of 1692 became a symbol not only of tragedy, but of the importance of protecting the innocent. For the families who lived through it, though, the trials were more than a symbol. They were a lived memory. Each passing generation carried with it the names of those who had been hanged or pressed to death. Gravestones and family stories kept the sorrow alive. The name of Giles Corey, pressed beneath stones, became a reminder of stubborn resistance. The names of women like Rebecca Nurse and Martha Corey became examples of faith and dignity in the face of injustice. In time, the village of Salem changed. It became a town, then a city, its harbor busy with ships and trade. The meeting house that had once echoed with accusations gave way to newer buildings. Life moved forward, as it always does. And yet, beneath the cobblestones and fields, the memory of 1692 lingered. Each generation rediscovered the story, retold it, and asked again, how could it have happened? The answer, perhaps, lies not in the strangeness of the past, but in the familiarity of human fear. The Salem Witch Trials remind us that fear can cloud reason, that power can be misused, and that communities can turn against themselves. But they also remind us of resilience, of those who resisted, of those who later sought to make amends, and of the slow, imperfect path toward healing. Tonight, as we reflect on these events, the story rests not in the hands of judges or accusers, but in ours. We remember so that we do not repeat. We tell the names of the innocent so they are not lost. We let their memory be a quiet guide, teaching us the value of justice, compassion, and courage in the face of fear. The Salem Witch Trials began with whispers of unseen forces in the winter of 1692. They ended with silence, regret, and the long work of healing. Centuries later, they remain a reminder of the shadows that can fall upon any community, and of the light that can follow if we choose to face the truth. And so, with this final reflection, the story of Salem draws to a close. The gallows are gone, the prisons are empty, the fields are green once more. Yet the lessons remain, carried across the years like echoes. May we listen to them well, and may the memory of those lost be a blessing. As our long journey through Salem comes to its end, we find ourselves returning to where it began. A small village on the edge of a vast wilderness. Winter winds rattling the shutters of wooden homes. A few children falling ill, their fits and cries sparking questions that would ripple through an entire community. From those quiet beginnings, fear grew and spread until it consumed lives and reshaped history. But now, as we step gently out of those troubled years, we can look back with calm reflection. The frenzy of accusations has faded into silence. The gallows stand empty. The voices of ministers and magistrates have fallen quiet. What remains are lessons, stories, and memories that have traveled across centuries to reach us here tonight. When we speak of the Salem Witch Trials, it is easy to focus on the tragedy. The innocent lives lost, the cruelty of suspicion, the weight of injustice. Yet within that darkness there are also lights to be found. The courage of those who stood firm in their innocence. The humility of those who later admitted their mistakes. The resilience of families who carried on, even when grief weighed heavy upon them. In remembering Salem, we are reminded of our shared humanity. People then were not so different from us now. They loved their families, tended their homes, worried about the harvest, and hoped for better days. And like us, they sometimes faltered. They let fear outweigh reason. They made choices they could not undo. To walk through their story is to see ourselves reflected, both our frailty and our strength. As time passed, the people of Massachusetts sought to mend what had been broken. Apologies were offered. Restitution was made, though imperfectly. Sermons and writings reminded future generations of the dangers of hysteria. And slowly, quietly, the wounds began to heal. Salem did not remain forever defined by its darkest chapter. It grew, changed, and carried forward. Even as the memory lingered, tonight we too carry that memory, and in doing so, we become part of the long chain of voices who have kept this story alive. Each time it is told, each time the names of the accused are spoken, the past is given a measure of dignity. It is a way of saying, you are not forgotten. Your story continues, not as a warning alone, but as a reminder of compassion, justice, and the importance of listening before judging. There is also a kind of comfort in the passing of time. What was once immediate and raw has become distant and gentle, softened by centuries. We can hold the story now without the sharp sting of fear. We can rest in its lessons, learning without being consumed. And in that way, the story itself becomes like a quiet lullaby, a rhythm of memory and meaning that rocks us gently into reflection. As we close this chapter, and with it, the entire tale of the Salem Witch Trials, imagine the village as it is now. The homes long gone, replaced by new buildings and busy streets. The fields once walked by farmers, now part of a modern town. Yet beneath the ground, beneath the layers of time, echoes of 1692 remain, not to frighten us, but to remind us of how far we have come. History has many such echoes. Salem is but one of them. There are countless other stories, in countless other places, where human frailty and human resilience intertwine. And each time we listen, each time we let the past speak, we give ourselves a moment of pause. We slow down, reflect, and perhaps see the world around us with a little more care. So tonight, as you rest, let this story settle gently within you. Let the names and faces of Salem drift into quiet memory. Let the lessons soften into reassurance. That fear can be overcome, that mistakes can be mended, and that even in darkness, there is light to be found. The people of Salem are long gone, but their story endures. It endures not because of fear, but because of our need to understand, to remember, and to grow. And in telling it, we honor not only them, but ourselves, our ability to listen, to learn, and to move forward with greater wisdom. And so, with gratitude for the journey we have taken together, we close the book on Salem. The gallows are quiet, the fields rest in peace. The names of the innocent drift like leaves upon the wind, carried not in sorrow alone, but in remembrance. May this story bring you calm reflection. May it remind you that even in the darkest chapters of history, humanity continues. And may it guide you gently into rest as the night deepens around you and sleep draws near. Good night, dear listener. Rest well.